Conservatism may rarely announce itself in maxims, formulae, or aims. Its essence is inarticulate, and its expression, when compelled, skeptical. In this episode of Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks, we turn to Roger Scruton's The Meaning of Conservatism, first published in 1980, third edition published in the year 2014, a year before the perhaps most influential and well-known conservative philosopher of the early 21st century died. Let's go to the text. The Meaning of Conservatism was first published by Roger Scruton in 1980 when he was a young but already recognized as a brilliant philosopher and, shockingly to many of his colleagues, an advocate of conservatism. He republished with some alterations, minor ones, in the year 2014, several years before he died in the year 2020. But then what we can do is see that there's a continuity in his conservative philosophy over the course of those many directions. But as he suggests, the book starts as a reaction of his when he was a relatively young man to the 1960s and the transition from a militant old left to a more scattered but nonetheless still militant new left, and the rebellions that had occurred in many cities around the world, but principally and most notoriously in Paris in 1968. The original version of this book was a young man's book, a response to events that are now all but forgotten. I had witnessed the student revolution in Paris, had lived through its effects in the universities where I studied and taught, and had rebelled against the prevailing ethos of rebellion. So there are rebellious philosophies and rebellious political activists, and Scruton's temperament and his philosophy is going to be the opposite of whatever that rebelliousness stands for, and that's what needs to be articulated in this book. The experience had convinced me, first, that I was a conservative, and secondly, that conservatism is not about freedom, but about authority. And this is an important contrast that Scruton is indicating right off the bat. Often people on the more liberal side of the political divide will say, first and foremost, we are free agents and we should jealously guard against any authorities that want to infringe upon or take our freedoms. We may need to grant a certain amount of authority to the government and so forth, but nonetheless that needs to be bound and so forth. Freedom first, authority nested within protections of freedom. And what Scruton is arguing and indicating right from the beginning is that the proper order is the reverse of that. Conservatives are not about freedom. Rather, authority is going to come first and freedom is going to be downstream from that. What does this mean? Now, by the time we are seeing the publication of this book in 1980, the first edition, there is a transition going on within the conservative movement, particularly the political conservative movement in terms of formal party politics in Britain, the rise of the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher, and allied to a significant extent with Ronald Reagan and a kind of conservatism across the Atlantic Ocean in the United States of America. And Scruton is dismayed by these developments within the Conservative Party. I sought to distinguish conservatism from economic liberalism and also to counter the Conservative Party's emphasis on free markets and economic growth. Now, this is interesting. In one respect, we might say that the Paris revolutions and many of the New Left and so forth, activist rebelliousness revolutionaries of the 1960s, had also been opposed to free markets and capitalism and a certain kind of economic liberalism. But in opposing the New Left and that sort of revolutionism, socialism, one should not mistake conservatism as then being in favor of some sort of free market liberalism or capitalism. Scruton's position is going to be, so to speak, a plague on both of their houses, and just as we need to distinguish conservatives from liberals, we are also going to need to distinguish conservatives from the socialists. So there's going to be two principal enemies here. But here he is lamenting the Conservative Party's drift toward economic liberalism. Instead, conservatism, as I describe it, involves the attempt to perpetuate a social organism through times of unprecedented change. And notice interrupting here the language of social organism, that it is society that is the living, breathing, organic thing. And this is at least a metaphor, perhaps a very strong metaphor, and perhaps even to be taken literally. Individuals are not the primary unit of reality or the primary unit of value from the perspective of political philosophy. It is society conceived of here as an organism. Now, picking up the quotation again, organisms can be cured by growth, but they can also be killed by growth. So we're not just in favor of economic growth, say, for example. And that is briefly what we are now witnessing, not only in England, but throughout the Western Hemisphere. So economic liberalisms and the individualistic form of it has led to a lot of growth, but that growth is not necessarily good, and it's certainly not a value that we should be striving for. At the same time, the other side of the political fence, or at least part of the big triumvirate, the debate between the socialists, the liberals, and the conservatives, let's have a look at the socialists and the current incarnation of Marxism. When he was in university, he says, and a young professor, it should be remembered that at that time, the late 70s, socialist and Marxist ideas were orthodoxy in our universities, and indeed that it was almost unheard of for anyone openly to dissent from him. And Scruton goes on to argue that he was basically the only conservative at his college, the only exception being someone who was not even on faculty. It was the lady who ran the tea room, the lunch counter, a very nice Roman Catholic lady from Naples, Italy, who had a portrait of the Pope behind her. And so she was a conservative, Roger Scruton was a conservative, and the whole rest of them were socialists of some form, either various forms of new left socialists or old-fashioned Marxist socialists, and so on. So he has many enemies, and indeed they are the dominant, they are the orthodoxy. Now, at the same time, though, there is a long tradition in the West of liberal political philosophy, and it makes appeals to ideas of natural rights and natural justice, and Scruton is skeptical about those. The ideas of natural rights and natural justice are by no means the invention of liberal political theory, however much liberal political theory in contemporary time appeals to them. But then Scruton goes on as a philosopher and political philosopher, noticing the history of these concepts. Not only are they old, they're extraordinarily controversial. They continue to be debated. Even the advocates of them can't agree upon themselves where they come from and what they consist of. So Scruton is entering a note of strong skepticism about these concepts. And we'll notice that he put natural justice and natural rights in scare quotes. But that there are natural rights existing objectively and independently of any positive law which might otherwise be held to have created them is a disputed thesis in philosophy. And disputed is often code word for saying something that can't be proven, something that a minority of people will accept, but perhaps a majority don't. And Scruton is indicating that he's on the side that disputes their existence. Now, the distinction here is between natural and positive. And natural, then, is to be something that exists, so to speak, prior to our identification of it, prior to our acknowledgement of it. There's a fact about reality in somewhere out there, or some feature of human nature that's inbuilt in us that serves to ground the claim that there's natural justice or natural rights. The contrary position is to say that these things should be conceived of as positive creations. That is to say, they don't pre-exist. Instead, they are made up by governments. Government comes into existence. It has a certain amount of power. Human beings invent or make up certain principles that they're going to call laws, and they declare certain things to be rights or justice, but they could have declared various other things to be rights or justice. So the argument then between the advocates of natural basis for the principles and the artificial positive creation is deep, and Scruton is indicating skepticism toward the natural tradition, and that more likely it is the positive tradition that is the fundamental one. And here's the problem that he has with the natural position, particularly the naturalist position, as it comes down through modern liberal political philosophers. Those philosophers, and he names here Aquinas, Grotius, and Locke, who have attempted to build ideas of legitimacy upon a foundation of natural law, have disagreed over almost every detail of the resulting political structure. And the latest attempts at the enterprise, those of Robert Nozick and John Rawls, particularly in the 1970s when those two philosophers wrote their big books, shows how far philosophers remain in disagreement, both as to the content of our natural rights and as to the nature of the political system that might secure them. So the point here is that if they really are natural, then using the light of reason and studying nature, we should be able to identify what these principles are, what the facts of nature are, just as the scientists do. And if we cannot do this, even after many centuries of trying to do so, and if the contemporary advocates of such things come up with very different ideas about what politics should look like, as Nozick and Rawls do, nonetheless both of them being liberal natural rights type of philosophers, then there's something deeply wrong with that approach to philosophy. So, natural rights, liberalism, natural law, skepticism. What about another vaunted modern political philosophy concept? Democracy. However, Scruton points out, democracy is as contested an idea as natural justice. It may be that we esteem democracy, I'm not going to entirely throw it out, but not as an end in itself, but as a means to other things which could in principle be achieved without it. So the suggestion here is that democracy may merely be a means to an end. But first, as political philosophers, we have to figure out what those ends are. What are the goals? What are the proper aspirations of society? Identify those, and then we might then talk about what mechanisms are going to bring us to that. Is it going to be a constitutional monarchy? Is it going to be some sort of new aristocracy? Is it going to be democracy in various forms? That's going to be at most a secondary debate. It's not the case, contrary to some modern democracy theorists, that what we do is we say individuals should be free, have their own ideas, participate in the political process, everybody should get a vote, and then whatever comes out of the vote, that's the right way to do politics, and those are the right policies. Scruton is skeptical about that approach as well. Now, there's also the important fact that Scruton is a philosopher, and that then is to say that he is approaching his political theory from a philosophical perspective. And one of the important parts of philosophy is epistemology, which is then to say whatever we want to say is true or whatever we want to say is good or right, we have to then be able to answer the follow-up question. Well, how do you know that that is true, and how do you know that that is right? How do you distinguish the true from the false, the better opinion from the worse opinion, and so forth? What is the nature of the knowledge claim that you are making? And what Scruton is going to indicate is that conservatism is more allied with skeptical traditions in epistemology. And one of his criticisms then, both of liberalism and socialism, is that they are optimistic about the possibility of knowledge, that they think they can figure out true principles, articulate them, and then remake society in terms of those principles. And so this is an important epistemological claim from Scruton about conservatism's underlying philosophy. Conservatism may rarely announce itself in maxims, formulae, or aims. Its essence is inarticulate, and its expression, when compelled, skeptical. So conservatism is not about trying to come up with maxims and formulas and aims, or even to articulate goals for all of society to be achieving and so forth. Instead, it is going to be more practical, more inarticulate. And it may be, of course, that when forced, as he says here, compelled, that they will try to come up with some aims or principles, but that's not where they are. They're starting somewhere else, and they're going to be skeptical about any sort of political philosophy that is too articulate or too much leading with explicit principles and abstract thought and so forth. He wants to say that the 20th century's experience historically should be a cautionary tale for political philosophers who try to be too much emphasizing ideas, philosophies, articulate principles, and ideology. The 20th century, as Scruton puts it, is memorable for nothing so much as its violence, and the attempt to understand this violence has brought with it the rise of political ideology. So the suggestion here is that the ideologists have been in control and they have caused the wars. They've caused all of the violence. And so rather than conservatism's skepticism and the fact that it comes across in many cases as inarticulate, that is not a vice of conservatism, but perhaps a virtue of conservatism. Description of the wars, quote, "As the ignorant armies clashed in the night of Europe, a rumor spread that there were causes, in scare quotes, for which they fought, causes such as, again in scare quotes, equality, freedom, and social justice." And what's interesting here is that Scruton is indicating that the ideologists have a certain amount of power, and they're trying to explain and urge on the wars in the names of their ideologies, but really there are other forces at work. It is the ignorant armies. The armies don't know what they are fighting for or why they are fighting for. So perhaps ideology is a problem. It's egging on in the wrong direction human political activity and leading us to be more violent than we otherwise would be. So there's something about the European mindset that is captured by the idea of being ideological, and that is a big part of what conservatism is going to be against. Diagnosis. The European mind seeks for a deep description of its politics, a description which reflects its real predicament, but which also remains uncontaminated by the day-to-day. Socialists and liberals have contended for this mind, each claiming to provide the system of principles with which to pass from policy to doctrine and from doctrine back to policy. That's what both the the liberals and the socialists do, even though they have a different deep description that they would like to impose upon the rest of us. And the conservatives then, epistemologically and cognitively, are in a different place. Quote, "Conservatives who see value in prejudice and danger in abstract thought have extemporized, expressing their beliefs in vague and conciliatory language." That's a virtue of the conservatives. Virtue means being prejudiced, right? Not trying to think that we can set aside all of our prejudice and come up with some abstract political theory and remake the world in terms of it. And the fact that the conservatives have come across as vague and conciliatory, whereas the conservatives and liberals are all full of their own self-importance and their virtue and saying we have the right, true way of doing the world, and have seemed much more morally on fire, have in some ways seemed more attractive and more energizing than the conservatives have. But let's not overlook the value in that conservative stance. But we are living in an ideological time, particularly an ideological century, and Scruton goes on to lament that fact. Quote, "However, neither the socialist nor the liberal can be appeased. Their bigotry, and there is no greater bigotry, I shall suggest, than the bigotry of liberalism, permits no conciliation, while their statements seem clear, definite, founded in system. So the bigotry here is the idea that they have a system, and they think that they have a system, and they're committed to the idea of a system. That is a bigotry. Now, there's an intentional irony here, because liberals especially like to pride themselves on being tolerant and open-minded and diversity, right, and so forth, but nonetheless, that is only a superficial feature of liberalism from Scruton's philosophical perspective. It's the underlying cognitive commitments of liberalism especially that he thinks are dangerous. And it's interesting to note this suggestion here that both the socialists and the liberals are bigots, but the liberals are the biggest of the bigots. And we'll come back to more on that later. With respect to the conservatives, now that we are laying out the political landscape, who are the problems that we need to face then as liberals? How can we better characterize the enemy? Their characteristic and most dangerous opponent is not the radical who stands squarely against them, armed with myths and prejudices that match their own, but rather the reformer who, always acting in a spirit of improvement, finds reason to change whatever he cannot find better reason to retain. It is from this spirit of improvement, the legacy of Victorian liberalism and social Darwinism, that modern socialists and modern liberals continue to derive their moral inspiration. So we have the conservatives, and then we have, of course, the radicals who say we want to abolish everything and change everything. Now, of course, those are enemies of the conservative, but Scruton is indicating that they are not the worst and most dangerous enemy, because at least we know what they stand for. We can stand up against them more forthrightly. It is the reformers who want to just change this, and in incremental ways take us down a path, a garden path that's going to end in a brick wall of some sort from Scruton's perspective. But nonetheless, they are in a way more dangerous, because they are taking us in a sneakier way, and it seems, well, it's not so bad. We just want to change this a little bit here and there, but cumulatively it's going to take us in a danger place. So conservatives are not radicals, and they are not even reformers. Now, conservatism is then described as an attitude. It's not a set of ideas per se. It's not a doctrine. It's not a system. It's an attitude. Conservatism is a stance that may be defined without identifying it with the politics of any party. And now he goes on, Scruton that is, to indicate his dissatisfaction with the drift and direction of the current Conservative Party, Margaret Thatcher, and the generation of the 1980s. In recent years, the Conservative Party has often seemed to be about to break with its tradition. It has joined in the competitive market of reform, endorsing the delegation of power, the code of economic internationalism, the free market economy, which it once so strenuously opposed. So, in the old days, the good old days, the Conservative Party stood for tradition. It was against internationalism. It was then nationalistic. It was not about competition and competitive reforms. It was about keeping things the way they are. It was not about the free market economy. Instead, it was about protectionism and some sort of more narrowly closed kind of economy. That's what the Conservative Party traditionally stood for. Scruton is indicating his approval of that, but recently the Conservative Party has compromised. It's gone over to one of the other sides. It's adopted internationalism, cosmopolitanism, free markets, and competition, all the rhetoric of the liberals. And so what he has seen then over the course of his lifespan, particularly in the most recent 18 years in office, the continued subjection of educational and social and legal institutions to the egalitarian ideology associated with socialist planning. So not only have the conservatives adopted and brought into conservative significant amounts of liberalism, it has also adopted a significant amount of socialism. That is to say, the conservatives used to not be in favor of liberty and equality. They were the party of tradition, but rather now they have been compromised, right? And their integrity has been breached from both directions. And so they also have, so to speak, sold out to modernity, sold out to the contemporary times, and said, we're going to be conservative in some respects, but we also want to be liberal and we want to be egalitarian. In short, as Scruton puts it this way, the Conservative Party has often acted in a way with which a conservative may find little sympathy. And so he's not at all sympathetic to where the Conservative Party is in his lifetime. Most of all, and now notice the most of all, it has begun to see itself as the defender of individual freedom against the encroachments of the state. Now, that's a bad thing. It should not be about defending individual freedom. The Conservative Party has said it's concerned to return to the people their natural right of choice. Pausing, Scruton is indicating governing is not about returning to people their natural rights of choices. And, picking up the quotation again, to inject into every corporate body the healing principle of democracy. A little bit of sarcasm there. It has become more democratic, Scruton is indicating as a conservative, to resist the encroachments of more and more democracy. Now, these are passing fashions, he wants to go on to say, that they are well meant, not always misguided, but by no means the ineluctable expression of the conservative point of view. So while he laments the direction that the Conservative Party is taking, he hopes that it is, as he puts it here, just a passing fashion, and that conservatism can return to its real roots, its real foundations in tradition. Now, a very strong point I want to emphasize coming up toward the end of this paragraph here. The result has been either transitory or unmeaning urges to reform, or else the wholesale adoption of the philosophy which I shall characterize in this book as the principal enemy of conservatism. I'm going to pause there and say this is a strong statement because here he is identifying what he takes to be the number one bad guy, the principal enemy of conservatism. And if we think of a deeply historically informed philosopher writing at the end of the 20th century, early on in the 20th century, who would be the natural candidates for conservatives to identify as the worst enemies they need to face up to? Is it fascism? Is it National Socialism? Is it socialism? Is it old-fashioned dictatorial governments? Is it some sort of Marxism or updated in some sort of neo-Marxism and so forth? And Scruton goes on to say, no, the number one enemy of conservatism is none of those. So picking up the quote again, the philosophy which I shall characterize in this book as the principal enemy of conservatism, the philosophy of liberalism, with all its attendant trappings of individual autonomy and the natural rights of man. So the worst enemies of conservatives are those who believe in the natural rights of man, those who believe in individual autonomy, and on the basis of that, work that up into a liberal philosophy. That's the worst enemy that philosophically and practically conservatism is going to have to confront. Worse than Marxism, worse than communism, worse than Nazism, worse than fascism, worse than all of the other isms is liberalism. Now, more about Margaret Thatcher and the connection of Margaret Thatcher's version of conservatism and its compromise with the traditions coming out of liberalism. During the years of Margaret Thatcher's governments, we were encouraged to see national politics and indeed international politics in terms of some wholly abstract conflict between freedom and totalitarianism. pausing there. So here the idea is we have the Cold War that has been underway since the end of World War II in the 1940s, the descending of the so-called Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill named it in the late 1940s, the dividing of Europe into East and West, a certain number of countries in the East under the control of the Soviet Union, as Russia is now called, and the Western European nations allied with the United States of America. And the idea here is that the Western nations, United States and all of its allies, are on the side of freedom, and the Soviet Union and all of its allies or vassal states, however one wants to characterize them, are totalitarian types of nations. And the rhetoric then of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party by the time we get to the 1980s, echoing and symbiotically that of Ronald Reagan in the United States, is to say that we face this great philosophical and political battle between the forces of freedom and the forces of totalitarianism. And Scruton indicates a skepticism about this is just a wholly abstract way to describe what is going on. Between, picking up the quotations, the natural rights to speak and act one's mind and an unenforced, uneasy slavery. Now, properly stated, Scruton goes on to say, this distinction need not be naive, and indeed it has the backing of a whole tradition in political philosophy, reaching from Locke, that's John Locke, writing in the late 1600s, to Robert Nozick, writing in the 1970s. Moreover, it represents an essential part both of the rhetoric of American government and of the self-image of American society, so that political decisions of the highest seriousness are made in its name. This does not show, however, that the distinction can be put forward as though its clarity were immediate. So what he is arguing here is that this way of understanding the current global situation that Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party of her generation are echoing is really not a conservatism, it is an Americanism. And Americanism may have some conservative elements, but predominantly it is coming out of a liberal tradition. That is not an unsophisticated tradition, but nonetheless, Scruton has already indicated that he does not think that it is philosophically sound, and so he does not think in practical terms it's going to be all that useful in describing what's really going on in late 20th century politics. Now, there is some truth to it. When freedom meant freedom from communist oppression, that is to say, it's not freedom in the abstract, it's freedom against a very precise, practically identifiable target, then okay, we know what we are talking about. So when freedom meant freedom from communist oppression, conservatives could advocate freedom and know that they were more or less in line with what they had always believed. But with the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the emergence of a left liberal consensus, the old battle cry does nothing to distinguish conservatism from its rivals. So that way of characterizing is not merely abstract and so philosophically suspect, but it's also historically out of time. That is to say, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now by the time we get to 2014, we're a generation later, we need new language, new labels to describe what's really going on. It's not freedom versus totalitarianism. Now, freedom from communism, other forms of freedom. When we start to get down to brass tacks and stop talking about freedom in the abstract, but in specific issues, specific domains, there we can be clearer. So, free speech, Scruton takes up in this next section. But let us consider, in order to make the general issues a little clearer, just one small example, the freedom of speech. It is obvious that there cannot be freedom of speech in any healthy society. If by freedom is meant the absolute untrammeled right to say what one wishes and to utter one's views on anything, anytime, and anywhere. So the idea that as an individual right or as a natural individual good, people should be able to say whatever they want, and then perhaps we will consider some limitations on that. That is going to be the wrong position. There cannot be freedom of speech in that sense. Even liberal thinkers, picking up the quotation, have always recognized this fact, but they have seen the constraints on freedom as only arising negatively and in response to individual rights. Freedom should be qualified only by the possibility that someone might suffer through its exercise. That's from the liberal perspective. So we're starting from the idea that people have freedom, and we're going to consider constraints only to the extent that we can identify ways in which the exercise of my freedom might cause someone else to suffer. So the constraints are down the road in particular kinds of cases and after the fact, so to speak, with respect to respecting other people's rights not to be harmed. For the conservative, by contrast, constraint should be upheld until it can be shown that society is not damaged by its removal. So the order, in interjecting here, goes the other way around. From the conservative perspective, people should be in a constrained position. You are not allowed to say anything. That should be the default thing, unless we can show pretty clearly that your saying that sort of thing won't damage society. So we start with constraint and we allow freedoms under certain circumstances. For the conservative, I'm repeating this point because it's important, constraint should be upheld until it can be shown that society is not damaged by its removal. Thus, the constraints on freedom arise through the law's attempt to embody, as for the conservative, it must embody the fundamental values of the society over which it rules. So there's a society, the society has certain values, individuals are in that society, individuals are allowed freedom, including freedom of expression, to the extent that it can be shown that society's values are not damaged by allowing that freedom. Society and its values first, individuals and their freedoms, in this case free speech, comes second. And he goes on to give specific examples and a take on the long tradition of English common law. There is no freedom to abuse, to stir up hatred, to make or publish treasonable, libelous, obscene, and blasphemous utterance. In England, as in every civilized country, there is a law which forbids the production and distribution of subversive material, the law of sedition. Now, this law also makes it an offense voluntarily to stir up hatred between different sections of the community. Proper application of that law, which makes not only the manipulation of racial hatred, but also that of class hatred, into a criminal offense. So all sorts of historical restrictions on what one may say are quite proper from the conservative perspective. They are part of the social fabric. One as an individual is born into that, and one needs to follow the laws as they already pre-existingly have been decided in a way that reflects England's way of doing things. It is, emphasizing this point and putting it slightly more abstractly, it is a freedom to do precisely what is not forbidden by law. And what is forbidden by law records a long tradition of reflection on the nature and constitution of British society. So it's not that you as an individual come into the world with freedoms and the possible constraints on your freedoms are to be justified in a secondary effect way on that. Rather, you come into an existing society that has a long set of traditions and laws, and you are allowed freedoms within that tradition. So this is the British way, in contrast to what he's going to contrast to the more American way. The argument can be generalized. The freedom that British people esteem is not and cannot be a special case of that freedom advocated by the American Republican Party, the freedom of pioneering dissenters struggling for community in a place without history, the freedom which is connected in some mysterious way with free enterprise and the market economy. So indicating that the histories of America and Britain are different, so their understandings of freedom must be different. America was a new country. There was no legal system. There was no long set of traditions when the early American pioneers arrived. So they were, so to speak, all free agents, and then they developed a common law in order to protect those freedoms, and where it could be shown that the exercise of freedoms in certain ways would be harming other people and their freedoms and their natural rights, well then okay, we will grant those as exceptions. That's not the circumstance in Britain. Britain is an ancient country with a long set of traditions and laws. We in the current generations are born into that, and we are shaped by that and should accept that. So it is the law first and freedom second, in contrast, or at least to the rhetoric in America, where it's freedom first, the law second. And so Scruton goes on to argue this is the proper sense, the British sense. Freedom in this sense, the only sense which matters, is not the precondition, but the consequence of an accepted social arrangement. Freedom without institutions is blind. It embodies neither genuine social continuity nor, as I shall argue, genuine individual choice. So that then is to say we have to understand freedom only in the context of a previously existing institutional arrangement, traditions and formalized laws. So that set of institutions of formalized laws and traditions, that is prior. That is also then not only temporally prior, but conceptually prior. To make sense of what we are talking about freedom, it's always in the context of that set of institutions. And it's the wrong way to think about it is the liberal way of thinking about it, where we start with individuals who have freedom, and we're going to then justify or make up institutions such that they are going to protect those freedoms. Big conclusion then. The concept of freedom, therefore, cannot occupy a central place in conservative thinking. It's not to say there won't be a place for freedom in conservative thinking, but it's not a secondary, or it's not a central place or a primary place. It is secondary, tertiary. It comes down the road, so to speak. One major difference between conservatism and liberalism consists, therefore, in the fact that for the conservative, the value of individual liberty is not absolute, but stands subject to another and higher value, the authority of established government. Now, the word subject here is important, that you are, from the Scruton's conservative perspective, born a subject. You are not born free, you are born a subject to something, a higher authority. In contrast to the liberal way of thinking, which is to say you are born free and you are never a subject, rather the authorities only have freely delegated authority to protect your freedoms. Fundamental philosophical difference in politics. Government, the institution, right? The government is the primary need of people subject to the discipline of social membership, and freedom the name of at least one of their anxieties. So what we need first is not freedom, but rather we need government. And government is to provide for a number of values and for a number of needs that their subjects have. Freedom is only one of them on the list. It is through an ideal of authority that conservatives experience the political world. Their liberal opponents, whose view is likely to be ahistorical, will usually reject that notion as an antiquated survival of monarchical ideas of government. To put it briefly, carrying on now, conservatism arises directly from the sense that one belongs to some continuing and pre-existing social order, and this fact is all important in determining what to do. You belong to something that existed before you and in some sense is beyond you and will exist after you. That is the all-important fact. And again, the contrast is against liberalism. You're not first born as an individual that may then secondarily be a part of various social institutions. Rather, it's the other way around. So what this then means for the conservative, this is then the important thing. The important thing is that the life of a social arrangement may become mingled with the lives of its members. They may feel in themselves the persistence of the will that surrounds them. The conservative instinct is founded in that feeling. It is the enactment of a historical vitality, the individual's sense of his society's will to live. Now, unpacking some of the key concepts here. The important thing politically and certainly socially and culturally is that the society has a certain way of doing things. When new individuals come into existence, it needs to become a part of that pre-existing societies. That individuals have to feel. Again, this is the language of feeling here, not the language of identification or conceptualizing or recognizing rationally, right? It's a conservative instinct, right? It's a sensing of a will. And again, a historical vitality that society is the vital thing, that it has its own will to live. Again, going in the direction of a more organic understanding of society instead of an individualistic one. And this language of an organic understanding of society is made more explicit in the next section by Roger Scruton. It's not merely a metaphor or even a strong metaphor. But a society is more than a speechless organism. It has personality and will. Its history, institutions, and culture are the repositories of human values. In short, it has the character of end as well as means. So it is the society that is the real organism, that has its ideas, its personality, its will, that is the real unit of value that carries on across the generations. And so societies are not merely ends of the individuals involved in those societies. Rather, the society is both the means but also the end to its own continuation. This will lies for the conservative enshrined in history, tradition, culture, and prejudice. True conservatives have their ears attuned to these principles and try to live as a result in friendship with the nation of which they are a part. Their own will to live and the nation's will to live are simply one and the same. So I don't have my own independent will to live, and you don't have your own independent will to live, my dreams, your goals, and maybe we will form various kinds of institutions and social associations along the way. Rather, you are an individual, I am an individual. What we need to do is merge our wills with our nation and its will, become one with the nation, because that is the true unit of value, the true unit of reality that extends across the generations. Now, one more closing point about the intellectual nature of conservatives' enemies. We've talked a lot recently, in the preceding minutes, about liberalism, but socialism also does the same sort of thing. And Scruton wants to argue that part of the problem that conservatives have is rhetorical, that there is something particularly to the modern ear very attractive about intellectuals and ideologies and abstract systems of thought, that somehow, like scientists, we can figure out all of these truths about the reality and human nature and construct a vision and remake society in terms of it in some sort of top-down way. And this is a danger because he says in the case of socialism, this feature of socialism that needs to be overcome is very resistant even to the disastrous track record that socialism has had in the 20th century. And this is something that conservatives need to think about and figure out a better rhetorical way to confront. What is going on here? So here is the passage. The great intellectual advantage of socialism is obvious. Through its ability to align itself with ideals that everyone can recognize, socialism has been able to perpetuate the belief in its moral purity. So pausing there, right? So it's intellectual, it has ideals, and it particularly has beliefs about moral ideals and what it takes to be morally pure. That it gives socialism a great power rhetorically. But then if we look at the track record of socialism, that a socialist revolution may cost millions of lives, that it may involve the willful murder of an entire class, the destruction of a culture, the elimination of learning, and the desecration of art, will not leave the slightest stigma on the doctrines with which it glorifies its actions or on the people who have taken part in them. So even though socialism has been a disastrous genocide, mass murder, mass destruction of institutions and culture, all of that factuality, all of that history, even to the extent that people realize it, is not as powerful as the idea. It's the power of certain ideas that somehow attracts people. That's what the conservatives need to grapple with rhetorically. So the conservative attitude somehow needs to be articulated, even though that goes against the grain for conservatives, and it needs to go against the liberals who want to say we have to start with freedom and somehow justify the civil order. Instead, we need to find a way to make attractive both the attitude and the understanding that the civil order, the social organism, comes first. How to do that? Well, the conservative attitude demands the persistence of a civil order. That is the great conservative project. That is the meaningful quest for conservatism in the new generation.